They packed 7 families into a building designed for 2. Not by accident, by calculation. The landlords knew the math. The factory owners knew the math. Every city alderman who looked the other way knew the math. Keep wages just high enough to cover rent. Keep rent just low enough that leaving was impossible. Keep the workers close. Close enough to hear the factory bell from their window. Close enough that no one ever had time to ask why the window faced a brick wall. Inside those buildings, children were born in rooms without sunlight. Men worked 12-hour shifts and came back to sleep 6 to a floor. Women hauled water up 4 flights because no one had bothered to run pipes that high. The system ran on human endurance, and human endurance, it turned out, had a limit. When reformers finally broke open those buildings and showed the public what was inside, the entire industrial housing model collapsed within a generation, not because it was cruel, because it became impossible to pretend it wasn't. To understand how a system this dark became this normal, we need to go back to the moment before anyone thought to call it a problem. If you find yourself gripped by stories like this, where the machinery of everyday life turns out to have been running on something nobody wanted to look at directly, consider subscribing. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? To understand how it all began, we need to step into a world that was moving faster than anyone had words for. The world that built the tenement. The year is somewhere in the 1840s, and the industrial city is not yet a city in any traditional sense. It is a mechanism. Manchester, England, already known as Cottonopolis, processes more raw cotton in a single week than the entire kingdom had seen in a century 50 years earlier. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, glows orange at night from the mouths of its furnaces. Chicago is being assembled in real time, street by street, rail line by rail line, out of ambition and mud. Birmingham, in England's industrial Midlands, hammers and forges metal goods that end up on every continent on Earth. These cities are not growing, they are erupting. What drives every single one of them is not capital alone and not technology alone. It is labor, raw, abundant and necessary in quantities that no agricultural society had ever needed to organize before. The factory floor demands bodies, dozens per shift, hundreds per district, thousands per city. And those bodies need to arrive at the factory gate on time, rested enough to function, and close enough that the walk to work does not consume more energy than the wage is worth. This was the fundamental problem of the industrial city, and it was not a small one. No one had ever managed a workforce of this scale before. No government had a blueprint for housing 50,000 working-class migrants inside a radius of 2 miles. No landlord had ever been asked to shelter this many people on this little land. The pressure was immediate, physical and absolute. Solve it, or the factory stops. Solve it now. The solution that emerged was not debated in parliaments or designed by architects. It grew organically from the intersection of desperation and profit, and it grew fast. Existing buildings near factory districts were subdivided. Single-family homes became multi-family warrens. Warehouses were converted into sleeping quarters. Cellars were rented out as dwellings. And then, as demand kept rising, purpose-built structures began to appear, narrow, tall, cheap, and dense. Buildings where every square foot that could produce rent was made to produce rent, and every square foot that could not was eliminated. The tenement had arrived, and it came not as a scandal, but as a solution. The architecture of necessity. To stand in front of one of these buildings in 1860 is to understand immediately what it was built to do, and what it was not built to do. The facade is plain brick, 3 or 4 stories high, pressed tight against identical buildings on both sides. There are windows, but they face other windows, other walls, other buildings just as close and just as dark. The street below is narrow, unpaved in many cities, shared by horses, coal carts, and a stream of workers moving in shifts at hours that have nothing to do with sunrise or sunset. Inside, the hallway smells of coal smoke, cooked cabbage and damp wood. The stairs creak under constant use, because in a building like this, the stairs are never quiet. Someone is always going up. Someone is always coming down. The schedule of an industrial city has no natural pause. One shift ends and another begins, and the hallway never fully empties. The apartments themselves, if they can be called that, are typically 1 or 2 rooms. In New York's Lower East Side, A standard tenement unit of the 1860s measures roughly 3.5 meters wide and 9 meters deep. There is a front room that faces the street, and a back room that faces nothing, or faces a narrow air shaft so thin that light never reaches the bottom. A family of 6 occupies this space, not because they want to, but because there is nowhere else. A family of 8 is not unusual. A family of 10 in the worst cases is documented. Lawrence Vaylor, the housing reformer who would later fight to destroy this system, surveyed a single block on the Lower East Side in 1900 and counted more than 2,000 people living in buildings that occupied less than a city acre. 2,000 people on one block, sharing 6 outdoor toilets. The density was not a failure of planning. It was the plan. The tenement was also, crucially, a financial instrument. Landlords who owned these buildings in industrial districts understood that their asset appreciated, not through improvement, but through compression. The more families you could fit inside a fixed footprint, the higher the return. Maintenance costs could be minimized because tenants had no power to demand repairs. The queue of people desperate for any roof was always longer than the supply of roofs. This created a landlord class with a structural incentive to let buildings decay while continuing to collect rent, and a tenant class with no legal mechanism to resist. The building was not a home. It was a machine for extracting rent from people who had no alternative. The men who built the system, behind every tenement district, there was a figure who made the calculation and signed the deed. In New York, the most visible of these figures was not a villain in any simple sense. He was a pragmatist operating at the intersection of real estate, immigration, and industrial growth. Men like John D. Crimmins, who built tenement blocks in Lower Manhattan while simultaneously contracting for city infrastructure, understood themselves to be solving a problem, not creating one. The immigrant arrives at the dock with nothing. He needs a room. You provide the room. You charge what the market allows. The transaction is voluntary. The logic was airtight, and it was wrong. What these men did not account for, or chose not to, was the compounding effect of density on health. In a tenement building of 80 families with no interior plumbing, a single case of cholera became a building-wide outbreak within days. Tuberculosis, which required sustained contact in enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces to spread, found in the tenement the ideal transmission environment. Between 1865 and 1890, tuberculosis killed more people in New York City than any other single cause of death. It was not called the tenement disease, though it could have been. It moved through those buildings the way the coal smoke moved through the air shaft, invisibly, constantly, and without preference. The men who built and owned these structures were not ignorant of the disease statistics. The reports existed. The investigations had been conducted. As early as 1842, Edwin Chadwick's report on sanitary conditions in Britain had documented the direct link between working-class housing density and epidemic mortality, in terms that no literate person could misunderstand. The response from the property-owning class was not denial, exactly. It was a different kind of argument, that intervention in private property relations would destroy the investment climate, reduce the housing supply, and ultimately harm the very workers it sought to protect. The argument was made with great conviction. It was also, as it turned out, the argument of men who had built their wealth on the suffering they were being asked to address. Something was already wrong, not just with the buildings, but with the reasoning that had constructed them. The machinery begins to strain. By the 1870s, the tenement system that had seemed like an efficient industrial solution was beginning to reveal its internal contradictions in ways that could no longer be managed through bureaucratic silence. The cities had grown too large. The density had reached levels that even its architects had not anticipated, and the workers who filled these buildings had begun, slowly and at enormous personal risk, to organize. The labor movement of the late 19th century is often told as a story of wages and hours, and it was. But it was also, at its foundation, a story about space. Men and women who worked in factories for 12 and 14 hours a day and returned to a single room shared with 6 other people were not just economically exhausted. They were spatially suffocated. The tenement was not simply where they slept. It was the physical evidence of their position in the industrial order. Cramped, dark, temporary, replaceable. To fight for better housing was to fight for recognition that they were not interchangeable parts. In 1867, New York passed its first Tenement House Act, a modest piece of legislation requiring fire escapes, minimal ventilation, and basic sanitary standards. The law was almost immediately ignored. Enforcement mechanisms were weak, inspectors were few and poorly paid, and landlords with political connections found ways to delay or avoid compliance. The buildings continued to fill. The air shafts continued to collect garbage. The halls continued to smell of coal and disease and close-packed living. What the 1867 law revealed, despite its failure, was something important. The political system had acknowledged that the tenement was a problem. That acknowledgement, however weak, would not disappear. It would grow, slowly then suddenly, into something the landlord class had not prepared for. The question was no longer whether the tenement needed to be reformed. The question was, who would do it, and how much it would cost those who had built their wealth on the current arrangement. And that question had a way of making very powerful men very nervous. Before we reach the breaking point of this story, the moment when the tenement system finally began to come apart, if this history has made you see something differently about how cities work, about who bears the cost of industrial progress, subscribe to the channel. And I want to know, do you think what happened next was inevitable, or could it have ended differently? The photographs that changed everything. In the winter of 1888, a Danish-born journalist named Jacob Riis descended into the tenement districts of New York's Lower East Side, carrying a camera, flash powder, and a determination to show what the city's property class had spent decades not seeing. What he produced over the next 2 years would become one of the most consequential works of documentary photography in American history. A series of images collected under the title How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890. Riis did not invent the knowledge of tenement conditions. The reports had existed for decades. The mortality statistics had been published. The sanitary inspectors had written their findings. But something about the photograph did what the written report could not. When a reader in a comfortable brownstone on the Upper West Side opened the pages of Riis's book and saw a family of 7 in a room the size of a large closet, saw the children on the floor, the walls black with damp, the single candle casting its yellow light over faces too tired to look at the camera, the abstraction collapsed. It became impossible to process that image as data. It could only be processed as human. The reaction was not uniform. Some readers were outraged. Some were defensive. Some were quietly ashamed. Theodore Roosevelt, then a New York City police commissioner, wrote to Riis after reading the book and said it had been the most useful thing he had ever read about the city he was supposed to govern. The political machinery had been supplied with the one thing it lacked, an image that the public could not look away from. Lawrence Vailey, the young housing reformer who had already been working on tenement statistics for years, understood immediately what Riis had accomplished. In 1900, Vailey organized an exhibition of tenement data and photographs that drew thousands of visitors. He then drafted the legislation that would become the New York Tenement House Act of 1901, a law that did not merely suggest improvement, but mandated it in terms specific enough to be enforced and sweeping enough to make thousands of existing buildings legally uninhabitable. The minimum room size, the mandatory window, the indoor toilet, the fireproof stairwell. Every clause in that law was a sentence written against a specific form of suffering that someone had been allowed to profit from for half a century. The landlords who had built their portfolios on the old model did not accept this quietly. The legal challenges were immediate, well-funded, and argued with sophistication. The claim, once again, was that regulation would destroy supply, that forcing improvement would price the working poor out of the housing market entirely. The reformers had an answer ready, a system that kills its tenants through tuberculosis and cholera, and fire is not providing housing. It is providing a waiting room for death and charging weekly rent for the privilege. What the walls left behind. The Tenement House Act of 1901 did not end poverty in New York. It did not empty the Lower East Side or transform the mill districts of Manchester or Pittsburgh overnight. What it did was establish, for the first time in American law, that the body of a worker living in a rented room had legal standing, that the darkness and the bad air and the absent plumbing were not simply the natural condition of poverty, but a set of conditions that someone had chosen to create and that someone else now had the legal authority to require be changed. The physical transformation of tenement districts unfolded over the following decades, and it was neither clean nor just. Buildings that could not be brought into compliance were condemned and demolished. Blocks that had housed thousands of families were cleared for urban renewal projects that sometimes replaced tenements with public housing and sometimes replaced them with nothing at all. The populations that had lived in those buildings, Jewish immigrants on the Lower East Side, Italian immigrants in the north end of Boston, Polish workers in Pittsburgh's Hill District, were dispersed. Some moved to neighborhoods that were better. Some moved to neighborhoods that were different in form but similar in spirit. The tenement had been abolished. The conditions that had made it necessary had not. In Manchester, the back-to-back terrace houses that served the same function as the American tenement were cleared in waves from the 1930s through the 1970s, replaced by council housing estates that solved the problems of density and ventilation and indoor plumbing while creating new problems that no one had quite anticipated. The factory that had anchored each neighborhood often closed before the houses around it were fully demolished. In some cases, workers who had lived their entire lives within earshot of a particular mill were rehoused in estates far from the city center, just as the mill itself fell silent. The industrial relationship between housing and labor, the one that had made the tenement necessary, had dissolved. What remained was a landscape that had been shaped by that relationship and then abandoned by it. Today, the few tenement buildings that still stand in their original form are museums. The Lower East Side Tenement Museum on Orchard Street in New York preserves several apartments as they appeared in different eras of the building's history, the 1870s, the 1890s, the 1930s, each one a small, dark, astonishing room that visitors enter in guided groups and stand in for a few minutes before returning to the street. They come out quieter than they went in. Something about the size of those rooms does something to a person. The ceiling not quite high enough, the window not quite big enough, the walls close enough to touch on both sides. A room designed not for living but for tolerating, for lasting through the night long enough to return to the factory in the morning. That is what the industrial city built when it needed somewhere to put its workers. A room just large enough to keep them alive, and for 50 years, no one in power thought that was a problem worth solving.